Hello everyone. Today I would like to discuss Donna Parker's Special Agent. It was a book by Marcia Martin and illustrated by John Nilsson in 1957. It was by the Whitman Publishing Company. There are 7 books in the series. This one is the second of the series. I have not read the others, but I am super excited to do so. And we'll maybe be reading them and making a YouTube video since I think that the copyright is gone for these. Anyway, I wanted to show first the illustrations that are in this book that are just incredible. So throughout this discussion of the book, I will be having the video show the different illustrations. You'll notice that the chapter headings, there's only 3 or 4 of them. And that's because the actual illustrations for those repeat over and over. Even though the chapters are different, they each have a theme of either the election, the town, the older men in her life, and I don't mean that in a bad way, just her father and her uncle and some others, and then her interest in politics and being a newspaper reporter, and then also the mathematical side of it, which was taken over by her boyfriend. Kind of boyfriend, actually, I should say boy that was her friend. So let's go ahead and first look at the outside illustration. I want to discuss this a little bit. So these books have the most incredible coloring, and I just love the color on this one. There are different covers for the different books. I know there's definitely one other one for this one. But the green in this is just so 50s. It's just lovely. And I love that the illustration for the cover wraps around and goes to the back. And then you may think you know what this is actually a picture of. It looks like someone in somebody's house and she's finding them. It's actually not what's going on. This actually deals with the different classes that they had in their school at the time in the 1950s. And this is actually an apartment that the girls would use to review how to entertain the public, and friends and family coming over to their house. So this is actually in the school, in the apartment that's used for entertaining. I should say entertaining training. So that's also interesting. So let's talk about the different topics. So one of the topics is that this book, I'm not going to give any reveals. There's 2 main, what we call special agent mysteries that are going on in the book, and I'm not going to reveal what they are or who is involved. I'm just going to talk about the different aspects about 1950s life that go on in the book. So this book is about elections, which is fascinating considering this is, 2020 and 2021, which elections are definitely in the forefront of society's thoughts right now. So the father and uncle have a very interesting conversation where they are discussing the importance of the town, everybody voting and getting 100% of people to vote. And they even stress it doesn't matter who they vote for, especially in this sort of town. It's sort of implied that the 2 people that are running are kind of not so much different. It's more of just the importance of their right to vote. So it starts off with that, and there's some ladies present. And it's very interesting because there is a love affair that goes on later. I wouldn't even call it a love affair. It's more of someone being interested in someone, and it's mostly because she is interested in politics and she's interested in discussing politics, and that sort of creates the instance of interest. And the person, they end up getting married very quickly at the end, and it's just assumed that this career woman at the time will just quit her job and have kids at that point, and they're both very happy to have her do that. But the initial reason why they fell in love was because she's interested in the actual society at large and being a part of it, even though the marriage would then remove her from that. So that was interesting. It doesn't go into, none of this stuff goes into the more political and, higher thoughts about what's actually happening in the society. It's a great look at what is going on in the society at the time. and what the 1950s really looked like for everyday people. So the elections are the forefront of the whole book, in a sense. It's the backdrop for the mystery stories. And they stress the importance, and the whole point is that the school is wanting to get 100% of the student votes in their own election, because that could show the people of the town what they need to be doing. So it's kind of adults need to listen to the kids at the time, and they're not really kids, they're 14, 15-year-olds. The other thing that I thought was interesting is not only the stressing of the importance of voting, but that everybody chipped in. So the females at the school all went around and babysat for the women in the society, and they really dealt with this concept of how exactly can women vote when they're at home while the husbands are working, and they have all these young kids that have to be taken care of, and you can't exactly, drag 2 or 3, 4-year-olds at the time to a polling station and stand in line and do all that. And most of them would have been walking because, they didn't exactly have 2-car households. So there was a lot of carpooling by the boys. They would go and pick everyone up and take them to the polling stations, and then the females of the high school would all go to babysit for the adult women, which was great. And I think it's kind of a lesson that we should think about today, in terms of we don't really address how do people get to polling stations and how do they find the time in a working environment, especially when they have children. It also dealt with personality traits that we, as a society now, kind of, I think, have a tendency to not want to address. So there was a person in the story who feels that she is a know-it-all and she's very bossy. And everyone knows it, and everyone talks about it very bluntly, and she knows that she's not liked. But in the book, she goes through quite a hardship, and then sort of just changes. They don't have any, specific talk with her saying, you know what, you're a know-it-all and a bossy person. It's just more of this idea that the hardships that come through life can generally do good things to personalities, and that it sort of balances a trait of that they know it all or that they deserve it all, kind of. It was a very interesting concept. And then it also deals with friendship, and friendships among 14-year-olds especially, and that it's a very easy tendency to assume bad intentions in situations and things that people do that you don't actually know why they're doing it. So if there's some sort of mystery involved, or you're not quite sure why they're acting the way they are, it's very easy just to go straight to the bad, especially when you're young. And it deals with not doing that, obviously, and sort of this idea that you really don't know what somebody is doing or what they're going through, and it's best not to assume bad intentions. And then also just that when you turn 14, 15, this is a time, all these kids in the story obviously have grown up together. Nobody moves. It's a time in life when everybody sort of stays in the same town for most of their life, or at least through most of their childhood. And their interests change over time. So you've got these friends that are very close, and it sort of deals with, there's nothing bad with, a friendship changing and morphing, especially when you both sort of start to figure out what it is that you want to do in your life and what you want to do, at least in your high school life, and that interests change, and just sort of how to deal with that separation of someone that was so involved in your life before. It deals also with so there's a character in there who had ran away when he was young, and it was considered running away, but it didn't really seem like a runaway like we would think. It was more about when you turn 16, 17 as a young man at that time, or in the 30s especially, you just sort of decide what you want to do. Are you going to stay in the town? But if you decide that you're going to leave, there's no contact at that time. There is phones, but it's not something where you would, be talking on the phone every day like we do now. It's a much more difficult process. And so he had moved to California from the Midwest in this story and basically just lost touch with family. And it sort of drives home how different things were and why people stayed in the same town their whole life. Because if you didn't, you're talking about, a separation of your entire family, all the people that you've known your entire life, because there's not a whole lot of methods for keeping in touch and for coming back. And he did write letters, periodically, but if you're busy living a life, especially a life of struggle, it's very difficult to keep in touch at that time. And, in the story, there's a problem with recognizing someone because, when they leave at 16, 17, and then you don't see them again until, let's say, they're 30 or 40, obviously even a family member will have, struggles with recognizing. And, back in that time, people assuming identities of someone that was not them could actually happen. Whereas nowadays, it's a much more difficulty because we're so watched and we're so photographed and we're constantly under surveillance by ourselves. I'm not saying by the state, but just, through our own choices. Whereas then it was much, much more easy to be lost in the society, I guess. So this was also, it dealt a lot with the war and how the war affected the daily interests of the school and just the society at large. There was a large interest in spy helicopters and war equipment, and also just the idea of someone trying to get new ideas from the American public as a spy. So how easy it was, for people just to come over here and live because, there was no tracking. So you could come in, and say, okay, I'm an American, I'm going to just, work as, a regular person, and then get to know people that are working for military contracts and get the information to another country. So that was very interesting. Obviously it happens today too, but not so much in physical copies. Like, this was more about stealing actual paperwork, taking photos of it. It's just a very different way that they were able to get that information than what would happen nowadays. And then, of course, the thing I really loved about this is the home ec class. So the home ec class was all women. It didn't have any of the boys that were in the school. And it did teach them how to bake, which, you would think that most of the girls knew how to cook just from their own mothers or fathers, or, whatever the situation might be, just living at home, because most people had to cook. It wasn't such a fast food society as we have now. And they didn't actually know how to cook. It was very funny that, you think about how does a 14-year-old, learn? Well, they learned from school at this time. And so, they would try to make cakes and it was just, not working out and all these different things. And it was very funny to me to think, well, yeah, you forget that 14, 15-year-olds have to learn at some point how to do those things. And, until that happens, it's even in a society where everybody is cooking for themselves, they had to learn at some point. And, I've talked to my grandma about this during that time period because she grew up in a family of 13 where she did none of the cooking and she did all the cleaning. So sometimes I think families you'd have roles in a family, and that would sort of give you your skills as an adult. So it was very stressed that the home ec class needed to teach everyone at least a certain basic amount of skill. And then, of course, they had an apartment, and the apartment was part of the home ec class where they had to learn how to entertain, and the girls would set up parties and practice how to entertain when guests would come over, which I just find completely fascinating because, as the society has gone on, we're much more isolated and we don't really entertain as parties. I do think more of the upper classes, people who have a lot of money, probably do a lot more of that because they have the time and the energy. But in this time period, I think, a lot of the middle class, and because the middle class was so much larger, they did have a lot of entertainment. When you talk about a society where there's not a lot of outside social entertainment, and you have mothers who don't work outside the home, there's a lot more opportunity for people in a one-person working household to be able to entertain their friends and family and guests. And so that was a big part of the society and the education of the kids at the time. And I think that's lovely. Of course, it would be great if it was, co-ed and the boys would learn how to do those same sort of things. But I find it to be a lovely thought that they considered entertainment of other friends and family so important, and, just sort of the stress of the reason for life and existence is to interact with other humans and to form those bonds, and just how we do that in social situations where we may not know somebody yet. And how do you talk to them? How do you entertain them? How do you get to know someone you do not know? And I think that's a skill that really needs to, that's being lost in today's students, obviously. I took a home ec class in the 90s, and that focused more on food and sewing. And I'm sure that their home ec in the 50s also had some sewing. But it definitely did not have any entertaining. And I find that fascinating. And I don't actually know many schools that have home ec classes per se anymore. So this is a summary of why I just thought this book was so fascinating. It's also, the writing in it is incredible. I really enjoyed her writing. I think she's an excellent writer and very well put together. The people, the character development, the story itself is a great little mystery, and just all the different aspects of living in the 1950s. So that is it for my Donna Parker review. I did also put at the end of this the Indian mummy illustrations from that book, because I loved that book also. And if you enjoy Donna Parker, I think you would probably enjoy Troy Nesbitt and just that series. There's also a page at the end of the book that lists all the Donna Parkers and some Troy Nesbitts also, and some other 1950s sort of teenage spy novel books. I am planning on reading 2 other Donna Parkers. I do have them, the Hollywood and the spring one, and I'm probably going to read them on YouTube. I haven't decided, or just do a review, but I'm also very excited about those because I loved this book immensely. And normally I would just have a book club to talk about all this stuff with my friends, but now that we have COVID, I'm just going to do it this way. So I'm sure that will change over time. But hope you enjoyed it, and go read Donna Parker.